Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're talking about Monaco, and I need you to understand something right from the start. This is a country you could walk across in under an hour. We're talking about 2 square kilometers of prime Mediterranean real estate that somehow punches so far above its weight class it makes other microstates look lazy. This is a place where 1 in 3 residents is a millionaire, where they've literally been building the country outward into the sea because they ran out of land, and where the fire department's biggest operational challenge is probably finding somewhere far enough away to justify turning on the sirens. It's absurd. It's fascinating. And by the time we're done tonight, you're going to understand how a rocky cliff smaller than Central Park became one of the wealthiest, most densely populated, and frankly weirdest places on Earth. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and if you're new here, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. A very small rock. Picture yourself standing on the French Riviera, somewhere between Nice and the Italian border, looking out at the Mediterranean. The water's that particular shade of blue that travel brochures oversaturate, but which actually exists here. The sun is doing its thing. And if you squint just right, you'll see a rocky promontory jutting out into the sea like someone's geographic afterthought. That's Monaco. The entire country. All of it. 2.02 square kilometers of limestone cliff, luxury apartments, and the world's most concentrated collection of super yachts. To put that in perspective, Central Park in New York is 3.4 square kilometers. Monaco is smaller than Central Park. It's a country you could jog across before your morning coffee gets cold. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite being roughly the size of a small shopping mall, Monaco manages to be an actual sovereign nation with its own government, laws, police force and international relations. It's not a territory. Not a protectorate. Not some weird colonial leftover that everyone forgot to clean up. It's a real country. The second smallest in the world, right after the Vatican. And unlike the Vatican, this one has a Formula One racetrack, multiple casinos, and a population density that would make Tokyo blush. We're talking about 26,000 people per square kilometre. That's the most densely populated sovereign state on Earth. If you don't like your neighbours in Monaco, that's a genuine crisis, because they're approximately 1.5 metres away, and there's nowhere else to go. The country sits wedged into the French Riviera like someone squeezed it into the only available parking spot. It's surrounded on 3 sides by France, specifically by 3 different French communes that all touch Monaco's borders, which feels like geographic overkill. And on the 4th side, there's just the Mediterranean doing its best to ignore the whole situation. The entire northern border is essentially a line drawn through what used to be contiguous French territory. There's no natural geographic barrier. No river, no mountain range, no dramatic geological feature marking where France ends and Monaco begins. Just a border that exists because treaties say it does, which is honestly the most European thing imaginable. Now let's talk about the actual landscape, which is where things get delightfully absurd. The country is built on and around a limestone promontory called Le Rocher, literally the rock, which rises about 60 meters above the sea. This rock is ancient Mediterranean seabed that got shoved upward by tectonic forces millions of years ago and now serves as the foundation for Monacoville, the old town where the Prince's Palace sits looking down on everything like a very expensive surveillance camera. From Le Rocher, the land slopes down to La Condamine, which is the port area where all the yachts that cost more than small nations cluster together. And then there's Monte Carlo, the district everyone's actually heard of, where the casino lives and where the Grand Prix tears through the streets every May like an annual wealthy person's fever dream. The country's highest point is called Chemin de Revoir, which sounds grand until you realise it's only 161 metres above sea level. That's 528 feet. A mild hill. The kind of elevation change you'd barely notice on a highway in Colorado. But in Monaco, it's the summit, the peak, the highest point in the nation. You could climb from sea level to the top of Monaco and still have less vertical gain than going up the stairs in a moderately tall office building. The whole place is basically a tilted ramp from the water up to what passes for heights around here. And here's the part that genuinely blew my mind when I was researching this. Monaco has no natural water sources, none. No rivers, no streams, no springs bubbling up from the limestone, not even a decent pond. Every single drop of fresh water in the country is either imported from France or produced by desalination plants. The same goes for most of the soil. The rock is limestone, which makes for dramatic cliffs and nice building foundations, but absolutely terrible agriculture. Most of the gardens you see in Monaco, and there are some genuinely beautiful gardens, are filled with imported soil. They literally shipped in the dirt. This is a country so committed to existing in a place that doesn't naturally support it that they've had to import the ground itself. The climate, at least, cooperates. Monaco has a classic Mediterranean setup. Mild winters averaging somewhere between 8 and 12 degrees Celsius, warm summers around 26 degrees, and roughly 300 days of sunshine per year. Rain mostly shows up in autumn and late winter, which is considerate of it. Occasionally the Mistral winds blow down from the Rhone Valley and make everything unpleasant for a day or two. But mostly the weather here is what people mean when they say Mediterranean paradise in real estate listings. The kind of climate where outdoor cafes make sense year-round and where you can reasonably plan events 6 months in advance without worrying about snowstorms. But the really wild part, and this is where Monaco's geographic situation goes from small country to conceptual art project, is that the place has been actively growing. Not demographically, physically. Since 1861, Monaco has increased its total land area by roughly 20% through land reclamation. They've been building the country outward into the Mediterranean, one concrete platform at a time. More than 30% of Monaco's current territory is reclaimed land artificial ground built on top of what used to be open water. The entire Fontvieille district, which covers about 22 hectares, didn't exist until the 1970s. They just decided they needed more country and built it. And they're still doing it. There's an ongoing project called Anse du Portier that's adding another 6 hectares of prime waterfront real estate. When you run out of room, apparently you just make more room. Problem solved. This creates a landscape that's deeply, fundamentally weird. Monaco is 100% urban. Not mostly urban with some parks. Not urban, except for that nature preserve on the edge of town. Completely urban. There is no wilderness in Monaco. No untouched nature. No place where you can wander off and find yourself alone with the natural world. Every single square metre of the country has been planned, built on, landscaped, or otherwise incorporated into the urban fabric. It's the only country on earth that can make that claim. Even the Vatican has gardens. Monaco has ornamental plants in imported soil sitting on top of reclaimed land. Nature here exists entirely as a design choice. The coastline stretches for about 4 kilometres, which sounds like a reasonable amount of waterfront until you remember that's the entire national border on one side. 4 kilometres of Mediterranean access. You could walk it in less than an hour. Most of the beaches are artificial, either built on reclaimed land or covered with imported sand, because the natural coastline is mostly rocky cliff. Even the beach is a construction project. The Larvotto beach, which is Monaco's main public beach, sits on land that was reclaimed specifically to create a beach because the original coastline couldn't be bothered. Getting around this tiny vertical country requires some creative infrastructure. Monaco has more tunnels per capita than probably anywhere else on Earth. They've hollowed out the rock with road tunnels, train tunnels, pedestrian passages and parking structures, creating this whole underground network that lets you move around without clogging the extremely limited surface streets. The train station is built into the rock. There are public elevators and escalators connecting different levels of the city, because sometimes the most efficient route between 2 points is straight up. The Formula One Grand Prix, which uses public streets for the racetrack, literally runs through a tunnel at one point. The Monaco Grand Prix is the only F1 race where the cars briefly go underground. That's the kind of problem solving you get when your entire country is smaller than most college campuses. The flora and fauna situation is about what you'd expect for a place with zero wilderness and imported soil. Native vegetation is typical Mediterranean scrub maquis, they call it, which is hardy, drought-resistant stuff that grows on rocky hillsides and doesn't require much encouragement. But Monaco being Monaco, they've also established botanical showcases like the Jardin Exotique, which opened in 1933 and specializes in cacti and succulents from around the world. These plants thrive in Monaco's microclimate, which has enough warmth and sunshine to keep desert plants happy, but also enough humidity from the sea to keep things interesting. The gardens are genuinely impressive. There's just not very many of them, because again, limited space and imported soil. Wildlife is sparse and consists mostly of seabirds, small lizards, and whatever insects can survive in an entirely urban environment. There's a joke that Monaco has more millionaires per capita than trees, and while I haven't verified the exact math, it feels spiritually accurate. The marine life in the surrounding waters is more diverse. The Mediterranean here supports various fish species, octopus, and the occasional dolphin, but that's technically not Monaco's problem since they don't control much offshore territory. The sheer concentration of everything in Monaco creates some genuinely absurd statistics. There are roughly 515 police officers for a population of 38,000 people. That's one cop for every 74 residents. Monaco has more police per capita than anywhere else on Earth, which makes sense when you consider that a significant portion of the population consists of extremely wealthy people who would very much like their extremely expensive belongings to stay exactly where they left them. The fire department's response time is under 5 minutes to anywhere in the country, which is less impressive when you realise that nowhere in Monaco is more than 5 minutes from anywhere else. You could throw a rock from one end of the country and nearly hit the other end. Don't do that, obviously. It's probably illegal, and you'd definitely hit someone's yacht. Monaco doesn't have an airport because there's simply no room for one. The nearest airport is in Nice, about 30 kilometres away. And if you're wealthy enough to be bothered by a 30-minute helicopter ride, you probably have your own helicopter anyway. There's a heliport in Fontvieille on reclaimed land. Naturally, that handles flights to and from Nice-Côte d'Azur Airport. The whole thing is peak Monaco. We don't have space for an airport, so we just helicopter in from France. Problem solved. Moving on. Standing on La Rochère and looking out over the principality, you can see the entire country spread out below you like an architect's model. The port packed with gleaming white super yachts. The high-rise apartments stacked up the hillside like expensive Tetris blocks. The casino and the Hotel de Paris and all the other monuments to concentrated wealth. And beyond it all, the Mediterranean stretching out blue and infinite, utterly indifferent to the absurd little territory that humans have carved into its northern shore. The whole thing feels like someone placed a bet. How much civilization can you pack into 2 square kilometers? How vertical can a country get? How much can you build on imported soil over reclaimed ocean before the whole project collapses under its own audacity? So far, the answer is quite a lot, apparently. Monaco works against all geographic logic, against every principle of sustainable land use, against the basic common sense that suggests you shouldn't build an entire sovereign nation on a rock the size of a neighborhood park. It works. It thrives even. And the story of how this happened, how this implausible little territory became one of the wealthiest, most famous places on earth, starts about 7 centuries ago with a family, a fortress, and a really good disguise involving a monk's robe. But we'll get to that next. Chapter 2. The Monk Who Wasn't. Right, so about that monk disguise. But first, we need to rewind a few thousand years, because before Monaco was a principality run by an Italian noble family who took it through elaborate religious cosplay, it was just another chunk of Mediterranean coastline, where various civilizations stopped by, built some things, fought some wars, and generally treated the place like a strategic rest stop on the way to somewhere more interesting. The earliest evidence of humans in the area comes from caves just across what's now the French border, where archaeologists found remains they optimistically named Grimaldi Man, despite having nothing whatsoever to do with the Grimaldi family that would eventually run Monaco. These were Neolithic people, hanging around the coast somewhere around 6000 BCE, doing standard Neolithic things like making tools, hunting, gathering whatever grew on the rocky hillsides, and presumably wondering why they chose to live on a cliff with no fresh water when there were perfectly reasonable river valleys just inland. The location did have advantages: access to Mediterranean fishing, natural defensive position, decent climate, but you had to really commit to the lifestyle. By the Bronze and Iron Ages, the region was inhabited by the Ligures, ancient Ligurians, who occupied much of this northwestern Mediterranean coastline, and whose main historical contribution seems to be giving their name to the region before getting conquered. By literally everyone who showed up afterward. They left behind some archaeological traces, a linguistic legacy, and not much else. The Phoenicians arrived sometime around the 10th to 6th centuries BCE, establishing trading posts along the coast as part of their Mediterranean-wide commercial network that stretched from modern Lebanon all the way to Spain and beyond. They were master sailors and merchants, more interested in profitable harbours than territorial conquest. They were followed by the Greeks, who founded Massalia, modern Marseille, around 600 BCE and used the Monaco area as a coastal trading station. The Greeks called the place Monoikos, which is where the modern name Monaco likely comes from, though as with most ancient etymologies, there are competing theories and nobody's completely sure. One story claims it was named after a temple to Hercules Monoikos, supposedly meaning single house or single temple, because the hero allegedly stopped there during his 12 labours, probably to rest between slaying mythical beasts and having existential crises about his stepmom trying to kill him. The other theory is that Monoikos came from a local Ligurian tribe of the same name, which feels less mythologically satisfying but is probably more historically accurate. Either way, the Greeks didn't build much here. It was a way station, a place to dock ships, trade goods, and maybe sacrifice something to Hercules before continuing on to more important destinations. The legend of the Port of Hercules stuck around long enough that Monaco's modern port is still called Port Hercule, which is a nice bit of branding continuity across 2.5 millennia. Then the Romans showed up, as Romans tended to do, and conquered the Ligurian coast around 122 BCE. Monaco became part of the province of Alpes Maritimae, the Maritime Alps, and served as a minor port along the Via Julia Augusta, the coastal road the Romans built connecting Italy to Gaul. It wasn't a major settlement, no great temples, no significant garrison, no dramatic amphitheatre or forum. Just another stop on the Roman road network where travellers could rest, resupply and continue their journey without much ceremony. But just above Monaco, on the heights at La Turbie, the Romans built something that definitely was significant, the Trophy of Augustus, a massive monument erected between 7 and 6 BCE, listing all the Alpine tribes Emperor Augustus had conquered. The original structure stood nearly 50 metres tall, a towering declaration of imperial victory carved in stone. It's still partially standing today, towering over the landscape like Rome's way of saying, "Remember when we owned all of this?" You can see it from Monaco, this huge ancient victory monument looming on the hilltop, which must create an interesting psychological dynamic for a 2-square-kilometer principality that used to be part of someone else's trophy wall. Christianity arrived during the late Roman period, probably sometime in the 4th or 5th century, along with administrative decline, economic contraction, and all the other fun trends that characterized the empire's slow collapse. When the Western Roman Empire finally fell in 476 CE, the region entered that delightful phase of early medieval history where ownership changed hands more often than a disputed inheritance. Ostrogoths, Byzantines, Lombards, Franks. Everyone passed through, stamped their authority on things, and then got replaced by the next wave of whoever won the current war. The 8th through 10th centuries brought Saracen raids, Muslim pirates and raiders from North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, who terrorized the Mediterranean coast with such consistency that coastal populations often just fled inland whenever ships appeared on the horizon. Living on a prominent rocky outcrop jutting into the sea during this period was approximately as safe as painting a target on your house and ringing a dinner bell. The fortress that would eventually become Monaco didn't exist yet. The rock was just a rock, too exposed and dangerous for permanent settlement during an era when the Mediterranean was less cradle of civilization and more active war zone with pirates. By the 10th century, the region had been incorporated into the Holy Roman Empire, that sprawling medieval political structure that was, as the saying goes, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but which did manage to be extremely complicated. The Monaco area fell under the control of various local feudal lords, while the Republic of Genoa, the powerful Italian maritime city-state, expanded its influence along the Ligurian coast. In 1191, Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI granted suzerainty over the Monaco area to Genoa, essentially saying, "Sure, this is yours now, do whatever you want with it." The Genoese, being practical people who understood that a rocky promontory overlooking a natural harbour had military value, built a fortress on La Rocha in 1215. This fortress, this specific stone structure on this specific rock, is the key to everything that follows. Because this is what the Grimaldis will eventually take. But first, we need to talk about Genoa's catastrophic internal politics. The Republic was torn apart by a civil war between two factions, the Guelphs, who supported the Pope, and the Ghibellines, who supported the Holy Roman Emperor. This wasn't a theoretical, philosophical disagreement. This was the kind of factional violence where families got exiled, properties were confiscated, and political opponents occasionally ended up dead in ways that were technically accidents, but which nobody actually believed were accidents. The conflict consumed Genoa for decades, with control of the city swinging back and forth depending on which faction won the latest street battle or palace coup. The Grimaldis were a wealthy Genoese noble family aligned with the Guelph faction. They'd been prominent in Genoa since at least the 12th century. The family name came from Grimaldo Canella, who died in 1184, and they'd held various positions in the Genoese government back when they were on the winning side of local politics. But in 1296, the Ghibellines won decisively, and expelled the Guelphs from Genoa. The Grimaldis, along with other Guelph families, found themselves in exile, kicked out of their city and forced to figure out how to maintain their power and wealth from outside Genoa's walls. This is where Francesco Grimaldi enters the story. Francesco, who had the extremely apt nickname Il Malizia, the cunning or the malicious, depending on who's translating and how charitable they're feeling, was an exiled Guelph noble with a military background and apparently zero ethical reservations about fraud. On January 8th, 1297, Francesco and a group of his cousins and supporters approached the Genoese fortress at Monaco. They were armed. They had a plan, and Francesco was wearing a Franciscan monk's robe. The story goes like this. Francesco, dressed as a monk, knocked on the fortress gate asking for shelter. It was night time. A lone monk seeking refuge wasn't suspicious. The guards, being decent medieval Christians who probably didn't want refused shelter to holy man who then froze to death on their conscience, opened the gate, at which point Francesco and his hidden soldiers rushed in, killed or captured the garrison, and seized the fortress. They'd taken Monaco through religious deception, a fake monk with real swords. It's the kind of trickery that medieval chroniclers absolutely loved because it combined piety, violence, and clever strategy in exactly the proportions that made for good storytelling. Whether this actually happened precisely this way is debatable. Medieval sources are notoriously unreliable about dramatic details, and the monk disguise might be an embellished legend that grew more colourful with each retelling. But the core facts are clear. Francesco Grimaldi and his forces took Monaco on January 8th, 1297, through some combination of deception and violence, and the Grimaldis have celebrated this act of successful fraud ever since. Monaco's coat of arms features two monks holding swords, commemorating the event. The country's official founding date is January 8th, 1297. The national identity is built on a story of religious cosplay and treachery, which is honestly fantastic. Most countries try to sanitize their origin stories. Monaco just puts the con job right there on the coat of arms. But here's the thing. They didn't keep it. The Grimaldis held the fortress for only a few years before Genoese forces expelled them again in 1301. They'd won Monaco through deception, lost it through superior military force, and spent the next 3 decades fighting intermittently to get it back. The fortress changed hands multiple times. Different Grimaldi family members tried different strategies. Some attempted military conquest, others tried diplomatic negotiations. Eventually, in 1331, Charles I Grimaldi just bought Monaco from the Genoese, who then controlled it. After all the fighting, all the intrigue, all the dramatic fortress seizures, he settled the matter with a real estate transaction. Very anticlimactic, but effective. So by the early 14th century, the Grimaldis had finally secured permanent control over Monaco, a fortress on a rock that gave them a strategic coastal position and a base of operations for their various military and political adventures. They weren't independent, they weren't a principality. They were exiled Genoese nobles squatting on a fortress that was technically still part of the Genoese sphere of influence, but which they'd managed to acquire through a combination of violence, fraud, and eventually just paying for it like normal people. Monaco at this point was a military asset, not a country, a refuge for exiled Guelphs, a fortified position in the endless Italian factional wars. The place had no particular resources beyond its strategic location. No agriculture to speak of, it's a limestone rock with imported soil, remember. No trade goods. No wealthy hinterland to tax. Just a fortress controlling a natural harbour on a useful stretch of coast. The Grimaldis held it because it gave them military leverage and because, Having been expelled from Genoa, they needed somewhere to be. Monaco was their consolation prize, their backup plan, the place they ended up when they lost the main fight. And here's what's remarkable. From this unpromising beginning, a minor fortress seized through trickery by exiled nobles who then lost it, fought to regain it, and eventually just bought it, the Grimaldis built something that lasted. They held Monaco through the rest of the medieval period, through the Renaissance, through the early modern era, through revolutions and wars and the complete transformation of European politics. The monk disguise became a founding myth. The fortress became a palace. The military outpost became a principality. It took centuries. It required alliances, marriages, strategic treaties, and several near catastrophes that could have ended the whole project. But it worked. The lesson here, if there is one, is that sometimes history's most enduring institutions start with fundamentally absurd premises. A fake monk, a fortress taken through fraud, exiled nobles with nowhere else to go. If you'd been standing on La Rochère in 1297 watching Francesco Grimaldi in his borrowed monk's robe walking through the fortress gates with soldiers hidden in the darkness behind him, you would not have predicted that 728 years later, his descendants would still be running the place. You would have assumed this was just another episode in the endless medieval Italian factional wars, a footnote, a minor deception that would be forgotten by the next generation. But you would have been wrong, because the Grimaldis kept the fortress, and they kept it, and they kept it, through wars and sieges and political upheavals, and every catastrophe that Mediterranean Europe could throw at a 2-square-kilometer rock, they just held on. Which brings us to the next phase of Monaco's history, the part where the Grimaldis had to figure out how to survive as a tiny territory, wedged between much larger powers who viewed them as either a useful pawn or an annoying obstacle depending on the current political situation. That's where things get really interesting. Chapter 3. The Art of Not Getting Conquered. So you're a tiny fortress state on the Mediterranean coast. You control maybe 2 square kilometers of rocky territory, a decent harbour, and not much else. You're surrounded by kingdoms and empires that could crush you without even noticing. Your entire military consists of whatever garrison you can afford to pay, which is not many people. Your economy is fishing, harbour tolls, and whatever olives manage to grow on the terraced hillsides. And every major power in Europe is currently fighting wars that keep sweeping through your region like destructive weather patterns. How do you survive? If you're the Grimaldis, the answer is strategically switch protectors every time the geopolitical winds change direction. Marry into every important family you can reach and hope that you're useful enough to protect but not valuable enough to annex. After Charles I Grimaldi secured Monaco through that very civilized real estate purchase in 1331, the family set about consolidating their hold on their new fortress state. They expanded when they could, acquiring the nearby towns of Menton in 1346 and Roquebrune through a combination of purchase and strategic marriage. At their territorial peak, the Grimaldis controlled about 20 kilometers of coastline, still absurdly tiny by any normal standard, but roughly 10 times larger than Monaco alone. This gave them a bit more economic base, a larger population to tax, and the ability to claim they ruled something more substantial than a single fortified rock. Not that it made them anything approaching powerful, just slightly less vulnerable. The economy was exactly what you'd expect for a small Mediterranean coastal territory with no natural resources: fishing, maritime trade, harbour fees charged to ships that used the port, limited agriculture, some lemons, olives and wine grapes grown on laboriously constructed terraces carved into the hillsides. The population in the 14th and 15th centuries probably numbered in the hundreds, maybe reaching a few thousand if you counted Menton and Roquebrune. These were not numbers that allowed for grand ambitions. The Grimaldis ruled a fishing village with pretensions, and their main asset was Geographic, a fortress controlling a natural harbour on a strategically important stretch of coast. As long as that location mattered to larger powers, Monaco had value. The moment it didn't, the whole project was over. The 15th century brought the first real test of the Grimaldi survival strategy. The region sat wedged between the Kingdom of France to the north and west, and the Crown of Aragon, basically Spain to the south and east. Both kingdoms wanted influence over the Ligurian coast. Both had vastly superior military forces, and both viewed Monaco as a potentially useful pawn in their larger conflicts. In 1419, the Grimaldis formally became vassals of France, accepting French protection in exchange for acknowledging French suzerainty. This was a practical move. France was the closest large power, and having French backing meant protection from regional rivals. Then they switched to Aragon, then back to France. The Grimaldis played both sides with the shameless pragmatism of people who understood that principles were a luxury they couldn't afford. Jean I Grimaldi, who ruled from 1427 to 1454, navigated these shifting alliances with impressive skill, managing to keep Monaco nominally independent while constantly adjusting his protector based on who was winning the current war. It was medieval geopolitical tightrope walking. One wrong move backing the losing side too enthusiastically, or failing to switch allegiances at the right moment and Monaco could be annexed, occupied, or simply absorbed into whichever kingdom decided it was tired of the Grimaldis' games. In 1524, the Grimaldis made what turned out to be a nearly 2-century commitment. They placed Monaco under the protection of Spain, specifically under the protection of Charles V, who was simultaneously King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, making him about as powerful as a European ruler could get in the 16th century. The Spanish were dominant in the Mediterranean following various treaties and wars, and aligning with them made strategic sense. Spain stationed a garrison in Monaco's fortress, effectively controlling the territory's defence and foreign policy, while allowing the Grimaldis to remain as nominal rulers. It was a protectorate arrangement. Monaco kept its internal autonomy and the Grimaldi family kept their titles and income, but Spain made all the important decisions. This lasted from 1524 to 1641, nearly 120 years of Spanish protection, during which Monaco became culturally and politically tied to Spanish interests. The Spanish garrison was probably larger than Monaco's native population at various points, which created an interesting dynamic where the majority of armed men in the territory were foreign soldiers who answered to Madrid, not to the Grimaldis. Honoré I, who ruled from 1522 to 1581, managed the Spanish relationship carefully, understanding that his role was essentially to be a useful local administrator for Spanish strategic interests. He kept the fortress maintained, the harbour functional, and the local population compliant. In exchange, Spain protected Monaco from French expansion and from the various Italian city-states that might have had designs on the territory. But the Spanish period wasn't exactly peaceful, because nothing in 16th century Mediterranean Europe was peaceful. The Italian Wars, a series of conflicts from 1494 to 1559, involving France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, various Italian states, and basically everyone who had an army and a grievance swept through the region repeatedly. Monaco was caught in the middle of every major battle. The fortress was besieged. The territory was occupied. In 1507, French and Genoese forces briefly captured Monaco, expelling the Grimaldis before Spanish forces recaptured it and reinstalled the family. This happened multiple times. The Grimaldis kept losing and regaining control depending on who won the latest battle. It must have been exhausting. Every few years, new soldiers showing up at the gates flying different flags, and the Grimaldis having to quickly figure out whether to flee, negotiate, or just wait it out until their preferred protector reconquered the place. Meanwhile, internal Grimaldi family politics were about as violent as the external wars. Succession disputes were common, and the family had multiple competing branches, each with their own claim to rule Monaco. Assassinations were not unusual. In 1505, Lucien Grimaldi was murdered by his brother Jean II in a succession dispute, which is the kind of family drama that makes modern inheritance conflicts look civilized by comparison. The brother who kills you for the throne is technically solving the succession question, just not in a way anyone would put in the official chronicles without heavy euphemisms. These internal power struggles were as dangerous to the family's survival as any external threat. You could successfully navigate Spanish politics, manage French relations, and defend the fortress against siege, only to get stabbed by your cousin who thought he'd make a better ruler. The social structure in Monaco during this period was rigidly hierarchical and defined by the territory's small size. At the top, the Grimaldi family. Below them, a tiny nobility and merchant class, mostly tied to the family through marriage or patronage. Below that, fishermen, sailors, labourers, the people who actually made the economy function through their daily work, and then the Spanish garrison, who were technically at the bottom of the social hierarchy but practically were the most important people in the territory because they were the ones with weapons and training. The whole population was concentrated on La Rocha, living in close quarters in a fortress town where everyone knew everyone and privacy was basically impossible. It was the kind of place where social mobility didn't really exist because there weren't enough positions to move into. Culturally, Monaco developed a hybrid identity that reflected its complicated political position. The Grimaldis were Italian-Genoese nobles by origin and maintained Italian cultural connections. The Spanish protectorate brought Spanish influence, language, customs, administrative practices, and proximity to France meant French cultural elements inevitably seeped in as well. Add in the Mediterranean Catholic baseline that everyone shared, and you get this interesting mix where Monaco was simultaneously Italian, Spanish, French, and none of the above. The parish church that would eventually become Monaco Cathedral served as the religious and community centre, hosting marriages, baptisms, and funerals that tied the small population together through shared ritual. The economy remained stubbornly limited. There were no significant natural resources, no mines producing valuable metals, no unique agricultural products that could command premium prices, no manufacturing to speak of. Monaco's wealth, such as it was, came entirely from its strategic position. Harbour fees from ships using the port, tolls from maritime trade, fishing revenues, rent from the limited agricultural land. It was enough to keep the Grimaldi family comfortable and to maintain the fortress and administration, but it wasn't enough to make Monaco wealthy or influential. The territory survived because it was useful to larger powers, not because it was economically valuable in itself. This is an important distinction. Spain protected Monaco because the fortress controlled access to a good harbour in a strategically important location, not because Monaco itself was worth much. By the early 17th century, the geopolitical situation was shifting again. Spain was declining as a Mediterranean power, France was rising, and the Grimaldis, ever pragmatic, started to recalibrate their alliances. In 1612, Honoré II made a significant symbolic move. He took the title Prince instead of Lord, upgrading Monaco from a lordship to a principality. This changed absolutely nothing material. Monaco wasn't any larger, wealthier, or more powerful, but titles matter in European aristocracy, and Prince of Monaco sounded considerably more impressive than Lord of Monaco. It was pure branding, a public relations move that elevated the family's status without requiring any actual change in governance or territory. In 1633, France officially recognized Monaco as a principality through treaty, acknowledging the Grimaldis' sovereignty while also establishing French influence over the territory. This was the beginning of the end of Spanish protection. In 1641, Honoré II formally ended the Spanish protectorate and placed Monaco under French protection instead. Another alliance switch. Another recalibration based on which major power was ascendant. The Spanish garrison left, French influence increased, and Monaco continued existing as a tiny principality wedged into the French sphere of influence, playing the same survival game with a different protector. What's remarkable about this entire period from the 14th through 17th centuries is that Monaco survived at all. Tiny territories like this typically got annexed. They were absorbed into expanding kingdoms, conquered during wars, or simply ceased to exist when the ruling family died out or lost a crucial battle. But Monaco kept going. The Grimaldis held on through strategic marriages that tied them to influential families across Europe. They held on by switching protectors whenever necessary, showing no loyalty to anyone except their own survival. They held on by maintaining the fortress as a valuable strategic asset that larger powers wanted to control, but found more convenient to protect through proxy than to rule directly. The pattern was clear. Monaco was useful enough to protect, but not valuable enough to justify the administrative headache of direct annexation. Letting the Grimaldis rule as a client state under protection was easier than incorporating the territory fully and dealing with all the governance issues that would create. As long as Monaco remained strategically positioned, militarily weak, and politically compliant, the arrangement worked for everyone. The Grimaldis kept their principality and their titles. The protecting power, whether Spain or France, got control of a strategic position without the cost of direct administration, and the local population continued fishing and farming, and mostly just trying to avoid getting killed whenever armies marched through. By the mid-17th century, Monaco had established a functional model for long-term survival. Perpetual protected status under whatever major power was currently dominant, combined with just enough autonomy to maintain the fiction of sovereignty. It wasn't independence in any meaningful sense, but it wasn't annexation either. It was something in between a negotiated arrangement where Monaco traded real power for continued existence. The Grimaldis were essentially professional survivors, their main skill being the ability to read geopolitical situations and adjust accordingly before it was too late. Honoré II modernized the administration, built new sections of the palace, and generally tried to make Monaco look like a real principality rather than a fortress with delusions of grandeur. These improvements mattered. Appearances counted. If you're going to survive as a tiny state surrounded by empires, you need to project an image of legitimacy and permanence. The palace needed to look princely. The administration needed to function smoothly. The territory needed to seem like an actual principality, not just a military outpost that happened to have a noble family living in it. Looking ahead from the mid-17th century, Monaco faced centuries more of this same balancing act. French protection would continue, interrupted by occasional upheavals when France itself went through revolutions or wars. The Grimaldis would continue playing the survival game, adapting to new political realities while trying to maintain their privileged position. The territory would remain tiny, poor, and strategically positioned. and somehow, against all odds, it would keep existing. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to talk about what happened when Monaco tried to assert actual independence, when the French Revolution destroyed the old European order, and when the Grimaldists discovered that their careful survival strategy could be undone by events completely outside their control. That's next. Chapter 4. How to Survive Losing Everything. The French Revolution destroyed Monaco's entire survival strategy. For 5 centuries, the Grimaldists had navigated European politics by carefully choosing protectors, switching allegiances when necessary, and maintaining just enough usefulness to avoid annexation. They'd survived wars, internal family violence, and constant pressure from larger powers by being strategically flexible and politically expendable. And then in 1793, revolutionary France invaded, deposed the Grimaldi family, confiscated all their property, annexed Monaco as part of the French Republic, and renamed it Fort Hercule because revolutionaries loved renaming things after classical antiquity. For the first time since 1297, nearly 500 years, the Grimaldists did not control Monaco. They didn't even have Monaco. It just stopped existing as a separate entity. Prince Rainier III, who'd been ruling Monaco since 1733, fled into exile. The revolutionary government seized Grimaldi properties, redistributed land, and incorporated Monaco into the French administrative department of Alpes-Maritimes. Monaco's roughly 5,000 residents became French citizens. The principality was gone, the centuries-old sovereignty erased, and the Grimaldists were reduced to being exiled nobles with impressive titles and absolutely no territory to back them up. They settled mostly in Paris, living on whatever wealth they'd managed to preserve, holding on to their princely titles as a formality, while Monaco itself was governed as just another French district. Napoleon, who seized power in France in 1799, had zero interest in restoring tiny principalities that had been absorbed during the Revolution. He was busy building an empire, restructuring Europe, and fighting wars across the continent. Monaco stayed annexed. Rainier IV, who'd technically succeeded his father as prince in 1795, held a title to nothing. He was Prince of Monaco, in the same way someone might be King of the Moon, theoretically impressive, but completely meaningless in practical terms. The Grimaldis spent over 20 years in exile, watching from Paris as their ancestral territory remained part of France, and their sovereignty seemed permanently extinct. Then Napoleon lost. The coalition of European powers defeated him, and in 1814, the Congress of Vienna convened to redraw the map of Europe and restore the pre-revolutionary order. The Congress, dominated by conservative monarchies that had spent 2 decades fighting revolutionary France, was enthusiastic about putting old dynasties back on their thrones and undoing revolutionary territorial changes. Monaco's sovereignty was restored through the Treaty of Paris in May 1814. The Grimaldists could return. The principality was back. Rainier IV, after 21 years of exile, could finally return to actually rule the territory his title claimed. But there was a catch. Of course there was a catch. The Congress of Vienna placed Monaco under the protectorate of the Kingdom of Sardinia, an Italian state, rather than returning it to French protection. This was geopolitically convenient for the Congress, which wanted to limit French influence, but it was considerably less convenient for Monaco. Sardinia controlled Monaco's foreign policy and defence, and the Sardinian kings were frankly less interested in Monaco than the French had been. The relationship was distant. The protectorate felt more like neglect than partnership. The Grimaldists resented it, preferring the familiar French arrangement they'd had for centuries, but they didn't have much choice. Monaco was back, which was better than nothing, but it wasn't back on terms the Grimaldis would have chosen. For the next few decades, Monaco stagnated. The economy remained what it had always been: fishing, limited agriculture, harbour fees. The population stayed around 5,000. Prince Florestan I, who ruled from 1841 to 1856, struggled financially. The principality was poor. The Grimaldis were struggling to maintain their status on revenue that barely covered basic administration, and then in 1848, everything got dramatically worse. 1848 was the Spring of Nations, a year when revolutions erupted across Europe as populations demanded political reforms and national self-determination. The revolutionary wave hit Monaco in the form of a rebellion in Menton and Roquebrune, the two towns that constituted roughly 80% of Monaco's territory and population. The residents, tired of paying Grimaldi taxes while receiving essentially nothing in return, declared themselves free cities under Sardinian protection and rejected Grimaldi rule entirely. They were done. Florestan tried to regain control but failed completely. Monaco lost most of its territory, most of its population, and most of its tax base in a single rebellion. From 1848 to 1860, Monaco consisted of literally just Monacoville and the immediate surroundings: the rock, the fortress, the palace, and almost nothing else. The Grimaldis had lost 95% of their territory. Their population dropped to maybe 1,200 people. The tax base collapsed. They were nearly bankrupt. Charles III, who became prince in 1856, inherited what was essentially a failed state. Monaco was on the verge of total collapse, and there was no obvious path to survival. The traditional economy couldn't support a principality this small. The fishing revenues, the harbour fees, the agricultural income from the tiny remaining territory, it wasn't enough. And then in 1860 things somehow got worse. The Kingdom of Sardinia was in the process of unifying most of Italy into a single nation-state, and France helped with this project in exchange for territorial compensation. As payment, Sardinia ceded the Savoy region and the Nice area to France. Menton and Roquebrune, which had been in rebellion but were still technically part of the Kingdom of Sardinia's sphere, were sold to France as part of this deal. Monaco lost them permanently. France paid the Grimaldis 4 million francs in compensation, which was decent money but didn't change the fundamental problem. Monaco was now reduced to 1.98 square kilometres, its current size. A principality consisting of a single rock jutting into the Mediterranean with a population barely over 1,000. On the positive side, Monaco shifted back to French protection, which the Grimaldis preferred to the Sardinian arrangement. But that didn't solve the existential crisis. How do you run a principality when your entire country is smaller than most university campuses? How do you generate revenue when you have no natural resources, no agricultural hinterland, no significant trade, and barely any people to tax? Charles III was facing the kind of problem that historically ended with annexation. Monaco was too small to be viable. The traditional economic model was dead. Without a completely new approach, the principality would either collapse financially or be absorbed into France within a generation. Charles III, to his credit, had already been thinking creatively about this problem. In 1856, desperate for revenue, he'd legalized gambling. This was a radical move. Gambling was banned in most of Europe, considered morally suspect and socially destructive. But Monaco was desperate, and desperate principalities can't afford to be picky about revenue sources. Several attempts to establish a casino in Monaco failed. In the late 1850s, entrepreneurs tried and either couldn't attract enough visitors or couldn't make the economics work. Monaco was remote, difficult to access, and still had a reputation as a poor fishing village. Why would wealthy Europeans travel there to gamble? In 1863, Charles III granted a gambling monopoly to François Blanc, a French entrepreneur who'd successfully run a casino in Bad Homburg, Germany. Blanc was experienced, well-connected, and had capital to invest. He created the Société de Bains de Mer, the Society of Sea Baths, which received exclusive rights to operate gambling facilities in Monaco. In exchange, the Grimaldis would receive a percentage of the profits. If this worked, Monaco would have a sustainable revenue source. If it failed, the principality was probably finished. It worked. In fact, it worked spectacularly. Blanc understood that Monaco needed to be more than just a casino, it needed to be a destination. He built the Casino de Monte-Carlo, which opened in 1863 as an opulent gambling palace designed to attract Europe's wealthy elite. He built luxury hotels. He created the district of Monte Carlo named, with shameless branding, after Charles III, Mount Charles, as an entire neighbourhood devoted to upscale tourism and gambling. He built gardens, an opera house, restaurants, and all the infrastructure needed to make Monaco appealing to people with money to spend. He got a railway connection built from Nice to Monaco in 1868, making the principality accessible for the first time. Everything was calculated to transform Monaco from a remote failed state into a glamorous resort destination. Timing helped. In 1872, Germany banned casinos, shutting down Blanc's previous operation in Bad Homburg and creating a vacuum of legal gambling opportunities in Europe. Monaco stepped into that vacuum. Wealthy Germans, French, British, and other Europeans who wanted to gamble now had limited options, and Monaco, conveniently located on the Mediterranean with excellent weather, new infrastructure, and legal casinos, became the obvious choice. The casino's revenues exploded, money poured in, and Monaco's finances went from catastrophic to comfortable essentially overnight. In 1869, Charles III used casino revenues to abolish income tax for Monaco residents. This was brilliant. It made Monaco attractive to wealthy people as a residence, not just a tourist destination. If you were rich and didn't want to pay taxes, you could move to Monaco, enjoy Mediterranean weather and luxury amenities, and legally avoid income tax. The principality became one of Europe's first true tax havens, and the modern Monaco model was born. Attract wealthy residents through tax advantages, fund government operations through casino revenues and business fees, and create a self-reinforcing cycle where the presence of wealthy residents attracts more wealthy residents. The transformation was staggering. In 1860, Monaco was a failed state on the verge of annexation, barely surviving with a population of 1,200 people living on a rock with no viable economy. By 1880, it was an internationally famous luxury destination, home to one of Europe's most celebrated casinos and a growing tax haven for the continent's wealthy. The population was growing as workers arrived to staff the hotels, casinos, and service industries. Real estate development accelerated as demand for Monaco property increased. The Grimaldis went from near bankruptcy to comfortable wealth, funded entirely by their percentage of casino profits. The social changes were dramatic. Monaco developed a new class structure. Wealthy foreign residents who'd moved for tax purposes, service workers who staffed the tourism industry, and the original Monégasque population who were increasingly marginalized in their own principality. The international reputation shifted completely. Monaco was no longer that tiny Italian leftover territory that somehow still exists. It was the glamorous casino principality where the wealthy go to gamble and avoid taxes. The brand was established. The economic model was proven, and the Grimaldis had secured their dynasty's survival through what was essentially a Hail Mary gambling venture that somehow worked. François Blanc became one of the wealthiest men in Europe through the casino's success. He died in 1877, but his widow and heirs continued running the Société des Bains de Mer, maintaining the infrastructure and expanding Monaco's luxury offerings. The opera house attracted world-class performers. The casino hosted European royalty and aristocrats. The gardens became tourist attractions. Monaco had found a sustainable economic niche that didn't require natural resources, agricultural land, or significant population. It just required being a pleasant place where wealthy people could legally do things that were illegal elsewhere. There's something almost absurd about how this worked. Monaco lost 95% of its territory, nearly collapsed as a viable state, and saved itself by legalizing gambling and marketing itself as a luxury destination. The entire modern identity of the principality, the glamour, the wealth, the tax haven status, the Formula One race, the yachts in the harbour, all of it traces back to Charles III's desperate decision in the 1850s to legalise gambling, and François Blanc's execution of that opportunity in the 1860s. Without the casino, Monaco would likely have been annexed by France within a generation. The Grimaldis would have lost their principality permanently. The whole 700-year project would have ended not with dramatic conquest, but with quiet absorption into a larger state, because the economics simply didn't work anymore. But the casino did work. Monaco survived, and by the late 19th century, the principality had established the template it would follow for the next century and a half. Remain small, remain wealthy, remain dependent on attracting rich people who want to avoid taxes and enjoy Mediterranean sunshine. The traditional survival strategy of playing larger powers against each other was still relevant. Monaco maintained French protection and had to navigate French political expectations, but the economic foundation was now secure in a way it had never been during the centuries of fishing and agriculture. The transformation had happened in roughly 20 years, from failed state to luxury destination, from near bankruptcy to comfortable wealth, from a population of 1,200 to a growing principality with international renown. It was the fastest, most complete economic reinvention any European territory had undergone in the 19th century. And it set Monaco on the path toward its modern incarnation, a tiny sovereign state that exists primarily as a service platform for wealthy people who want minimal government interference and maximum luxury amenities. Charles III, who'd inherited a disaster and turned it into a success through gambling revenues, died in 1889. His son Albert I succeeded him and continued the development model, but the foundation was already established. Monaco was viable, the principality worked, the Grimaldis were secure, and the rock that had nearly been abandoned in 1860 was now one of the most expensive pieces of real estate in Europe. Which brings us to the 20th century, when Monaco would navigate 2 world wars, continue its evolution into a tax haven and celebrity playground, and cement its reputation as one of the world's strangest and most successful microstates. But that's the next chapter. Chapter 5. How to Marry a Movie Star and Transform Your Country. The 20th century brought Monaco 2 world wars, one extremely inconvenient French president, and the single best public relations coup any tiny principality has ever pulled off: marrying Grace Kelly. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start with Prince Albert I, who ruled from 1889 to 1922 and had the excellent sense to develop interests beyond casino revenues. Albert was a passionate oceanographer. They called him the Navigator Prince, or the Scholar Prince, and he funded scientific expeditions across the Mediterranean and Atlantic, conducted pioneering marine research, and in 1910 founded the Oceanographic Museum, which is still one of Monaco's major attractions today. The building itself is spectacular, perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, filled with specimens and research materials Albert collected during decades of scientific work. He gave the principality an intellectual reputation it absolutely did not deserve based on its primary economic activity, which remained operating a casino and charging no income tax. But the museum was impressive, the scientific work was genuine, and Monaco got to claim cultural sophistication alongside its gambling revenues. World War I tested Monaco's perpetual neutrality strategy. The principality declared neutrality, as it always did, but France stationed troops there for protection, which is the kind of protection that looks a lot like occupation if you're paying attention. In 1918, a treaty formalized the relationship. France guaranteed Monaco's independence, which sounds generous until you read the fine print that said Monaco had to align its foreign policy with French interests. Essentially, Monaco could be independent as long as it did whatever France wanted in international relations. It was independence with an asterisk, sovereignty with conditions, but it beat getting annexed, which was always the alternative. Albert I's son, Louis II, took over in 1922 and continued the casino-based development model with less personal interest in marine biology and more focus on administration. The significant event of his reign, aside from surviving the Great Depression, which Monaco did reasonably well because small size meant easier economic management, was the first Monaco Grand Prix in 1929. Someone looked at Monaco's narrow, winding streets and thought, let's race cars through here at dangerous speeds, and somehow this became an annual sporting event. The Grand Prix turned Monaco into an international sporting destination and created one of the most iconic images of the principality. Formula One cars screaming through tunnels and around hairpin turns in a residential area. It was absolutely insane, it was spectacular, and it worked brilliantly as marketing. World War II brought the usual Monaco response to European conflicts. Declare neutrality and hope everyone leaves you alone. It did not work. In 1940, after France fell to Nazi Germany, Italian forces occupied Monaco. Italy was allied with Germany, and Mussolini's troops controlled the principality, while officially Monaco remained independent in the same technical sense that a hostage is free to leave. Louis II cooperated with the occupation because the alternatives were worse. In 1943, when Italy surrendered to the Allies, German forces took over the occupation. Monaco spent most of World War II controlled by Axis powers, while maintaining the polite fiction of sovereignty. The situation with Monaco's Jewish population during the war was complicated and not particularly heroic. Some Jews were protected, some were deported. Louis II's record is controversial. He wasn't as actively complicit as Vichy France, but he wasn't running a resistance operation either. He cooperated enough with the occupiers to avoid worse outcomes while trying to protect some vulnerable residents. It's the kind of moral calculus that happens when you're a tiny principality occupied by Nazi Germany, and your options are cooperate somewhat or get completely destroyed. When the Allies liberated southern France in 1944, Monaco was freed with minimal physical damage because it was too small and strategically unimportant to be worth bombing. The war ended. The occupation ended. And Monaco went back to being a casino principality under French protection. In 1949, Prince Rainier III became prince at age 26 after Louis II died. Rainier would rule for 56 years, the longest reigning Grimaldi in history, and he inherited a stable but stagnant principality. The casino economy worked. Monaco was comfortable. But it was still relatively obscure internationally, known mostly to European elites who gambled and to people who followed Grand Prix racing. The population was around 20,000. The territory was still tiny, and Monaco's future was uncertain in a post-war world where European colonial empires were collapsing and microstates seemed like anachronisms that might not survive the 20th century. And then Rainier met Grace Kelly. In 1955, the prince attended the Cannes Film Festival and was introduced to an American actress who was, at that moment, one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Grace Kelly had won an Academy Award. She was beautiful, elegant, famous, and represented everything glamorous about mid-century American cinema. They met. They corresponded. And in April 1956, they married in what international media immediately dubbed the wedding of the century. The ceremony was broadcast internationally. American newspapers covered it extensively. European media treated it like a fairy tale, a Hollywood star becoming an actual princess in a Mediterranean principality. It was perfect narrative material. The impact on Monaco was transformative in a way that's difficult to overstate. Before Grace Kelly, Monaco was a European curiosity. After Grace Kelly, it was an international celebrity destination that Americans actually cared about. She brought Hollywood glamour to a principality that had previously been known for gambling and car racing. American interest in Monaco exploded. Tourism increased. The principality's international profile rose dramatically. Grace became Princess Grace, worked on charitable causes, promoted Monaco's cultural institutions, and basically served as Monaco's greatest public relations asset. She had 3 children, Caroline in 1957, Albert in 1958, Stephanie in 1965, and the royal family became a subject of international media fascination. Rainier, meanwhile, was transforming Monaco's economy. He understood that relying primarily on casino revenues was risky and that Monaco needed economic diversification to remain viable long-term. He expanded the territory through massive land reclamation projects. The Fontvieille district, built in the 1970s, added significant new land area. He attracted international businesses by offering favourable tax treatment and modern infrastructure. He developed banking and finance sectors. He encouraged light industry, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, precision instruments that didn't require much space but generated significant revenue. He built convention facilities, expanded the port, constructed luxury hotels, and generally modernized Monaco's entire economic foundation. The tax haven status became increasingly important. Monaco charged no income tax for residents, minimal corporate taxes for businesses, and offered privacy and stability that wealthy individuals and corporations valued highly. Billionaires moved to Monaco. Millionaires established residence there. International corporations registered offices in the principality. The population grew as foreign residents arrived by the 1980s. Monaco had around 30,000 people, and native Monegasques had become roughly 20% of the population. The majority were foreign residents attracted by tax advantages and luxury amenities. Monaco had essentially become a service platform for wealthy people, and the native population was a minority in their own country. This created tension with France. In 1962, French President Charles de Gaulle became extremely angry about Monaco's tax haven status. French citizens were moving to Monaco to avoid French taxes. French companies were registering in Monaco for tax avoidance. De Gaulle saw this as unacceptable tax evasion facilitated by a tiny principality that existed only because France allowed it to exist. He threatened to blockade Monaco, cut off utilities, and essentially force annexation. It was a major crisis. Monaco's existence was threatened again, this time not by war but by an annoyed French president who controlled all the infrastructure Monaco depended on. The crisis was resolved in 1963 through a compromise treaty. French citizens living in Monaco would have to pay French taxes. They couldn't avoid their tax obligations just by moving across the border. French companies operating in Monaco would also be subject to French taxation. But non-French residents of Monaco kept their tax-free status, and non-French companies could still benefit from Monaco's favourable tax treatment. It was a compromise that preserved Monaco's tax haven model while preventing French citizens from using it to dodge French taxes. The crisis passed. De Gaulle backed down from annexation threats, and Monaco continued existing, though the episode demonstrated yet again how vulnerable the principality was to French pressure. Through the 1960s, 70s and 80s, Monaco experienced a real estate boom. Land in the principality became some of the most expensive in the world. High-rise buildings went up everywhere because there was nowhere to build except vertically. The Formula One Grand Prix became one of the premier sporting events internationally. The Opera House attracted world-class performers. Cultural events, galas, and charity balls made Monaco a fixture in international society pages. Movie stars, athletes, and royalty visited regularly or maintained residences there. The casino remained important but was no longer the sole economic driver. It was one attraction among many in a principality that had successfully branded itself as the ultimate luxury destination. In September 1982, tragedy struck. Princess Grace died in a car accident on one of Monaco's winding mountain roads. She either suffered a stroke while driving or lost control of the vehicle. Accounts vary, but the car crashed and she died the next day at age 52. The international mourning was extensive. Media coverage was massive. Rainier was devastated and never remarried. Monaco lost its greatest public relations asset, the woman who had transformed the principality's international image and brought American attention to a place most Americans had never heard of before her marriage. But by 1982, Monaco's reputation was already established. The brand was secure. The economic model was proven. Princess Grace had done her work. By the end of the 1980s, Monaco had achieved something remarkable for a microstate. It had survived 2 world wars, navigated French pressure, diversified its economy beyond gambling, attracted an international wealthy resident population, and established itself as a successful model of what a tiny principality could be in the modern world. The challenges were real. Housing costs were astronomical, overdevelopment threatened the character of the place, and native Monegasques were increasingly marginalized in their own country by the flood of wealthy foreign residents. The Monegasque language, a Ligurian dialect, was being preserved through deliberate cultural efforts because otherwise it would have disappeared under the weight of French, English, and Italian speakers who dominated the population. But fundamentally, Monaco worked. The economy was diversified and stable. The political situation under Rainier III was calm. The international reputation was excellent. The principality had gone from 19th century gambling town to 20th century luxury destination and tax haven, and the transformation had been managed skillfully enough that Monaco emerged as one of the world's wealthiest microstates on a per capita basis. Real estate values were absurd. The resident population was disproportionately wealthy, and the whole operation functioned smoothly despite occupying less space than most college campuses. The Grimaldi survival strategy had evolved. It was no longer about playing major powers against each other or switching protectors when necessary. It was about providing services that wealthy people wanted: tax avoidance, luxury amenities, privacy, security, Mediterranean climate, and maintaining just enough sovereignty to keep those advantages. Monaco remained under French protection, had to coordinate foreign policy with France, and was vulnerable to French pressure, as the 1962 crisis had demonstrated. But within those constraints, the principality operated independently, maintained its own administration, and controlled its own economic development. The Formula One Grand Prix, held annually through the streets of Monaco, became a perfect metaphor for the principality itself. Absurdly impractical, spectacularly executed, internationally famous, and somehow working despite all the reasons it shouldn't. Racing cars at high speed through a residential area with minimal safety margins is objectively insane. But it's also thrilling, glamorous, and uniquely Monaco. The fact that it happens every year without being cancelled says something about Monaco's ability to maintain traditions that would be impossible anywhere else. Rainier III, by the late 1980s, had been prince for nearly 40 years and had overseen Monaco's complete transformation from post-war stagnation to modern prosperity. He'd navigated the Grace Kelly marriage and her tragic death. He'd survived the de Gaulle crisis. He'd diversified the economy and expanded the territory through land reclamation. He'd maintained political stability while Monaco's population demographics shifted dramatically. And he'd positioned Monaco to continue thriving into the 21st century as a tax haven, luxury destination, and improbable survivor in a world that had no obvious place for two-square-kilometer principalities. Which brings us to the modern era. Rainier's final years, the succession to his son Albert II, Monaco's role in contemporary Europe, and the question of whether a principality founded on a monk disguise in 1297 and saved by casino revenues in the 1860s can continue to exist in the 21st century as anything more than a historical curiosity or a very expensive tourist attraction. Spoiler, it can. But that's the final chapter. Chapter 6. Tax-free luxury apartments for billionaires. So here we are in the 21st century, and Monaco is still going, 728 years after Francesco Grimaldi showed up in a monk's robe with hidden soldiers. 160 years after Charles III legalized gambling in a desperate attempt to save a failed state. 50 years after Grace Kelly brought Hollywood glamour to a Mediterranean principality most Americans had never heard of. The Grimaldis are still ruling. Monaco is still sovereign. And the whole operation has transformed into something that would have been completely unrecognizable to anyone from any previous century. A two-square-kilometer tax haven that functions primarily as a luxury service platform for the global ultra-wealthy. Rainier III continued ruling through the 1990s and early 2000s, presiding over continued economic success as real estate values climbed to genuinely absurd levels. In 1993, Monaco joined the United Nations, which gave the principality full international recognition as a sovereign state. This was significant. Monaco was being treated as a legitimate country by the international community, not as some historical quirk that should have been absorbed into France decades ago. But with international recognition came international pressure, particularly regarding Monaco's banking secrecy and tax haven status. The OECD started making noise about money laundering concerns. The EU wanted tax information exchange. Monaco was forced to implement some financial transparency reforms, reluctantly acknowledging that complete banking secrecy was no longer sustainable in the modern international financial system. In April 2005, Rainier III died at age 81 after ruling for 56 years. The international media coverage was massive, the end of an era, the passing of the prince who'd married Grace Kelly and transformed Monaco from post-war stagnation to modern prosperity. Prince Albert II succeeded him at age 47, inheriting a stable, wealthy principality, but facing different challenges than his father had confronted. Albert was modern, educated with an economics degree, and was an Olympic athlete. He'd competed in bobsled at 5 Winter Olympics, which has to be one of the more unusual credentials for a reigning monarch. But he was also a bachelor, and succession was a legitimate concern. Monaco needed an heir. The Grimaldi line had survived 7 centuries. It would be embarrassing to lose it now because the current prince couldn't find a wife. Albert solved that problem in 2011 when he married Charlene Wittstock, a South African Olympic swimmer. The royal wedding got international media attention, though nothing like the Grace Kelly spectacle of 1956. In 2014, Charlene gave birth to twins, Jacques, the heir to the throne, and Gabriella. Succession was secured. The Grimaldi dynasty would continue at least one more generation. Albert also acknowledged 2 illegitimate children from previous relationships, handled with relative openness in a way that would have been scandalous in earlier eras, but which fit the modern royal family model of acknowledging reality rather than pretending it doesn't exist. Neither illegitimate child is eligible to inherit, but their existence is acknowledged. They have relationships with their father, and everyone just deals with it like adults. Albert II turned out to be passionate about climate change and ocean conservation, echoing his great-great-grandfather Albert I's scientific interests. In 2006, he founded the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation, dedicated to environmental causes. Monaco started positioning itself as a green luxury destination, promoting renewable energy, electric vehicles, and sustainable development. This creates an interesting tension. Monaco is simultaneously building more luxury high-rises on reclaimed land, environmental impact, questionable while promoting environmental conservation. But the oceanographic research continues as a family tradition, and Albert seems genuinely committed to climate issues, even if Monaco's carbon footprint per capita is probably horrifying given the concentration of wealth and the yacht situation. The economy continued diversifying. By the 2020s, casino revenue represented less than 5% of Monaco's GDP. The casino that had saved the principality in the 1860s was now a minor contributor to the overall economy. Banking, finance, real estate, luxury retail, yacht services, conference hosting, and tourism had all become more important than gambling. Monaco had successfully evolved from casino town to diversified luxury service economy. The real estate market became the most expensive in the world on a per square meter basis, prices ranging from 40,000 to over 100,000 euros per square meter. The population reached around 38 to 40,000 residents, with Monegasque's native citizens still comprising only about 20%. 80% of the population is foreign. Monaco has essentially become an international enclave where wealthy people from around the world maintain residence to take advantage of the tax benefits and luxury amenities. And there's a waiting list. You can't just move to Monaco. You have to prove you have sufficient wealth and income to support yourself. You have to find available housing in a market where supply is severely limited, and you have to navigate the residency application process. Monaco is selective about who gets to live there, which maintains the exclusivity that's part of the brand. The tax situation remains Monaco's primary appeal. No income tax for residents, no capital gains tax. Low business taxes. If you're wealthy and want to minimize your tax burden legally, Monaco is an excellent option. But international pressure forced changes. In 2009, Monaco committed to OECD tax transparency standards after being placed on a grey list of uncooperative tax havens. Banking secrecy was reduced. Tax information exchange agreements were signed. Monaco is still a tax haven, but it's more regulated than before. The land reclamation continues because Monaco has never stopped trying to solve its fundamental geographic limitation through engineering. The Anse du Portier project, ongoing through the 2010s and 2020s, is adding another 6 hectares of new land luxury apartments built on artificial platforms extending into the Mediterranean. There are environmental concerns about the marine impact, about disrupting ecosystems and changing coastal dynamics. Monaco doesn't particularly care. The principality has been building itself into the ocean since the 1860s and sees no reason to stop now. As long as wealthy people want to buy extremely expensive apartments with Mediterranean views, Monaco will keep constructing them on reclaimed land. COVID-19 hit Monaco like it hit everywhere else. The casino closed temporarily for the first time since World War II. Tourism collapsed. Events were cancelled. But Monaco's economy recovered relatively quickly because the resident base is so wealthy. People who live in Monaco generally have the resources to weather a pandemic without catastrophic financial consequences. The principality's small size made lockdown management easier, and when international travel resumed, the luxury market bounced back faster than budget tourism. Monaco survived another crisis, this one epidemiological rather than military or political, through the same basic mechanism that's kept it alive for centuries, being small enough to manage and wealthy enough to absorb shocks. Contemporary Monaco faces some genuinely interesting challenges. Housing affordability is a crisis even for wealthy people. The real estate market is so expensive that even high earners struggle to afford property. Overdevelopment concerns are real. Monaco is building vertically and outward into the sea, and there's a legitimate question about whether the principality is losing whatever character and charm it once had in the pursuit of more luxury apartments and more wealthy residents. Traffic and congestion remain issues despite extensive tunnel systems and public transportation. The principality has built more underground infrastructure per capita than probably anywhere else, and it's still cramped. Maintaining Monegasque culture when 80% of the population is foreign is an ongoing challenge. The Monegasque language, a Ligurian dialect, is taught in schools and promoted through cultural programs, but it's genuinely endangered when the majority of residents speak French, English, or Italian. Native Monegasques receive special benefits: housing priority, enhanced social services, preference in some employment to compensate for becoming a minority in their own country. But there's a question of identity. What does it mean to be Monegasque when most people in Monaco aren't Monegasque, and when the principality exists primarily to serve the interests of wealthy foreigners? Climate change poses an existential threat via sea level rise. Monaco has built 30% of its territory through land reclamation. If sea levels rise significantly, that land becomes vulnerable. The principality would need massive investment in seawalls and protective infrastructure. For a country that spent a century extending itself into the ocean, the prospect of the ocean reclaiming that land is darkly ironic. Financial regulation remains a balancing act. Monaco wants to maintain its appeal as a tax haven while avoiding international sanctions. Too much regulation and wealthy residents leave. Too little and Monaco gets blacklisted, which would be catastrophic. The principality walks a careful line between preserving tax advantages and implementing enough oversight to satisfy international demands. But here's the thing, it works. Monaco shouldn't work. A 2-square-kilometer principality, smaller than Central Park, with no natural resources, 80% foreign population, and an economy based entirely on being a service platform for wealthy people, This should not be a sustainable model, and yet Monaco has one of the highest GDP per capita rates in the world. The crime rate is extremely low, helped by police state levels of surveillance with security cameras covering basically the entire principality. The streets are clean. The infrastructure is excellent. The government functions smoothly. Events like the Grand Prix, the tennis tournament, and various galas and conferences continue attracting international attention. The luxury brand is secure. Monaco has survived by adapting, from medieval fortress to strategic military position to Spanish protectorate to French protectorate to casino town to tax haven to luxury brand. Each era required a different survival strategy, and the Grimaldis or whoever was making decisions for them managed to identify what Monaco could offer that larger powers would tolerate. In the 14th century, it was strategic position. In the 18th century, it was being too small to threaten anyone. In the 19th century, it was legal gambling when gambling was banned elsewhere. In the 20th and 21st centuries, it's been tax avoidance and luxury services for the ultra-wealthy. The principality is still under French protection. France handles Monaco's defence and provides some essential services. Monaco has to coordinate its foreign policy with French interests. The relationship is not equal. France could annex Monaco tomorrow if it decided to, and Monaco couldn't do anything about it except appeal to international law and hope someone cares. But France has no particular reason to annex Monaco. The current arrangement works fine. Monaco exists as a semi-autonomous luxury enclave that doesn't threaten French interests and that actually serves useful purposes for wealthy French citizens who want to avoid French taxes while staying close to France. Prince Albert II continues ruling, managing the challenges of modern monarchy in a microstate. His son Jacques, born in 2014, is the heir, ensuring at least one more generation of Grimaldi rule. The family has now controlled Monaco continuously for 728 years. 728 years of the same family ruling, the same territory, surviving wars, revolutions, occupations, financial crises, and every other catastrophe European history could produce. That's genuinely remarkable. Most royal families don't last that long. Most territories don't remain sovereign that long. Monaco has done both. Looking forward, Monaco's future seems reasonably secure as long as two conditions remain true. France continues tolerating Monaco's existence, and wealthy people continue wanting tax havens. The first seems likely. France has no reason to change the current arrangement. The second seems almost certain. Wealthy people have wanted to minimize their tax burden since the invention of taxes, and that's not changing anytime soon. Monaco offers something that wealthy people value: a pleasant, secure, well-managed place to live with minimal taxation and maximum luxury amenities. As long as that value proposition exists, Monaco will have customers. The story of Monaco is fundamentally absurd. It starts with a fake monk in 1297. It nearly ends with bankruptcy in the 1850s. It gets saved by a casino. It gets transformed by marrying a Hollywood actress, and it ends up as a tax-free luxury apartment complex for billionaires where 30% of the land is artificial and 80% of the population is foreign. None of this should work. A principality this small should have been annexed centuries ago. An economy this specialized should have collapsed when circumstances changed. A territory this dependent on foreign residents should have lost its identity completely. But Monaco is still here, still sovereign, still ruled by Grimaldis, still functioning as a successful microstate in a world that has no obvious place for successful microstates. It exists because it's useful to wealthy people and because France allows it to exist and because the Grimaldis have spent 7 centuries figuring out how to survive against impossible odds through pragmatism, flexibility, and shameless willingness to reinvent themselves whenever the current model stops working. So if you ever find yourself standing on Le Rocher looking out over the principality, the casino, the yachts, the high-rises built on reclaimed land, the tunnel entrances carved into the rock, the surveillance cameras monitoring every street, remember that this whole improbable project started with a fortress, a disguise, and a family that refused to quit even when quitting would have been the sensible option. Monaco shouldn't exist, but it does. And barring some catastrophic shift in how the world works, it probably will continue existing for quite a while longer. Which is honestly pretty impressive for a rock smaller than Central Park. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next one.